Welcome to the 1717 Meeting House at West Barnstable, Cape Cod, Massachusetts, USA. If you've come here in the summertime between 9 and 4 for a self-guided tour, but you see that the door is shut, don't worry, it should be unlocked for you. Just come on in. As you walk into the Meeting House, you'll see to the right here a basket full of scrolls. This gives you a detailed history of the Meeting House and the congregation that attends it. And also, you'll see brochures about the 1717 Meeting House Foundation, which is in charge of the restoration, renovations, and maintenance of this revered home. Also, as you walk in, you'll notice this placard that has 2 QR codes. So all you need to do is take your cell phone camera and point it at that, and it will automatically launch one, a video of the meeting houses of Barnstable, of which this is the third, and another one about the restoration of this meeting house 70 years ago. So as you enter today through this doorway, you must be a guest of honor, because this is the doorway of honor. This is designed principally for the minister's family, and guests of honor of the minister to enter the meeting house. And at the right, where we have the bell tower, that is where the women of the parish would enter. And over to your left, that would be where the men of the precinct or the parish would enter. So come on in, make yourself at home. These are sheep pens, and they're not owned by any family, so you're welcome to open it up and come on in and see what it was like to be sitting in on a town meeting or sitting in on a sermon from 300 years ago. So where are we? We're in the meeting house that was built by the town of Barnstable for the West Precinct, which was established in 1715. About the same time, they established an East Precinct at the eastern end of town. Is it a church? No. This is a prototypical colonial meeting house. A meeting house serves things both sacred on the weekends and also the mundane business of the town, meetings of the town. It served dual purpose. So look around. It doesn't really look like a church. Some people say it looks like a barn. Some people say, oh, it looks like an upside down ship. Well, you're right. That's what the craftsmen knew how to do back 300 years ago. All the timber here and those beams and the huge beams and rafters above, those were hewn on site in 1715. They were even bent to bow a little bit by placing weights on them on the ends so that they could perfectly support the cross beams. I've now ascended into the pulpit. This is a very typical design from the 17th and 18th centuries. If you notice overhead, there's this canopy, and there's a thin veneer of wood here. This is called the sounding board, because if I were speaking from here, the sound would bounce off and reverberate and project my voice throughout the entire meeting house. And if the camera can pan a little bit, if you notice above the sounding board, about a foot over from this beam, you'll see a splice in the crossbeam. That is where, just 4 years after this meeting house was completed in 1719, the precinct was so large that they needed to cut the building down the middle along that line and pull over this side by 18 feet. They then filled in the middle and built the bell tower. That was done all in 1723. You're welcome to walk up the stairs. It's a little steep, And as you do, you'll find a whole nother level up here. On your way, you'll see original turnstiles that we found when we renovated the meeting house. These were original turnstiles turned by hand in 1717. So when you ascend the stairs, you'll see what we call the gallery. And the gallery holds perhaps even more people than the main level. And you'll see that from this level, you have a great sight line to the pulpit. And also in the far corner, not now, but in the 1800s, that was where the first school was in Barnstable. And if you're wondering, this organ is not original to the meeting house. This was installed in 2006. It was made in England by the Mander Organ Company. It has 9 stops to the grate, has 9 stops to the swell, and 5 stops to the pedal. And it fills this space very well. In fact, the American Guild of Organists often have a conference on Cape Cod, and this is one of their featured organs to demonstrate. So if you look closely, those pews are 70 years old. But the flooring below it, that is period flooring. That is actually the flooring that was here since 1717 when the meeting house was completed. So you might be visiting this meeting house because you heard that it's a famous meeting house for an early congregation. And in fact, you're right. The denomination associated with this meeting house is Congregational. There's nothing surprising about that. The Congregational religion, so to speak, or denomination, that was the standing order, the standing church of Massachusetts until 1833, when the state disestablished an official church. Now, that has historical impact on churches throughout New England. But the history of this particular parish is that its congregants started meeting in 1616 in a neighborhood of London, Southwark. Pastor Henry Jacobs was the first minister. He was a priest of England, and he originally went to Holland as a separatist, but decided to come back and try to purify the Church of England instead of fight it. His successor, John Lothrop, continued his efforts with the same congregation. But he and his congregation were thrown in prison for worshiping outside the official permission of the Church of England. Lothrop was actually imprisoned in the Clink. You've heard of somebody being thrown into the Clink. Well, that was the name of the most dastardly prison in London at the time, the Clink. And he and 42 of his congregants were imprisoned. They were allowed to be released as long as they agreed to be exiled to the New World, as they were in 1634. John Lothrop and his congregation sailed on the Griffin to Boston. Because his early assignment in the Church of England was in Kent, he knew that some of his parishioners from Kent had already set up shop in Scituate, just north of Plymouth. So he and his congregation set up shop in Scituate. He petitioned the governor a few years later, Governor Prentz, for more land so that they could establish a bigger community. And John Lothrop was granted land here in Barnstable, or Mattakees, as it was known at the time. So in 1638, some of his parishioners started coming over, and officially in 1639, half of the town of Scituate picked up and moved and established Barnstable, right up the road. And in 1644, they started meeting in Lothrop's house on Main Street, which is now the Sturgis Library. And in that library, you'll find the bishop's Bible that he brought over on the Griffith. 2 years later, they built the first meeting house in Barnstable, down the road on the property of what's now the Lothrop Cemetery. Several years later, they built an even bigger replacement meeting house at a place called Coggins Pond. If you see a railroad track going over 6A Main Street in Barnstable, the pond is right over to the left. In 1715, they decided that they needed to split Barnstable into an east and west precinct. And here we are now. So that very congregation that started off in 1616, in secret, in London, continued to Boston, to Scituate, to Barnstable. And when the town split, the minister at that time decided to establish his parish here, and so the lineage continues right here. So this is continued, this is considered to be Congregational Church number 1. And Congregational Church, what's a Congregational Church? It's where the congregation is in charge of their own affairs. Not a hierarchy in Rome or a hierarchy with the King of England. The congregation is itself in charge of its own affairs. And a principle of Congregationalism was that the Bible set the liturgy. Now think what happened. In 1611, that is when King James Version of the Bible was first published. So now, the massive Bibles that were first translated into English as the Geneva Bible, and then the Bishop's Bible that you can see at the Sturgis Library, they were for the priests. Well, now, with the King James Version of the Bible and the printing press, it became more democratic. And the Congregational Church wanted to have a one-to-one relationship with God through the Bible, not through a priest. And that's where we are today, in Congregational Parish number 1. Now, as you walk your way down the other stairwell, take a look at this. I just noticed this myself a few months ago. Look at these notches. There's 4 notches here and 4 notches here. I'm touching history. These were notched in 1715 so that on the ground they knew what was the perfect mate for this post and beam. So as you return downstairs, as you descend, take it easy, take it slowly, hold on to the handrails, and you might be wondering, what is this? Well, as we were restoring the meeting house in 1950, we discovered the original plaster under all the layers, and so we framed it up here for you to see. So now we're in the bell tower room. This was rebuilt 70 years ago during the restoration, but there's some really nice bits of history in here. One, if you can see over here, is a clapper on the original revered bell. In 1806, I believe, the town bought a bell made by Paul Revere to hang up in the bell tower. The bell was placed in honor of James Otis Sr., the father to James Otis Jr. and Mercy Otis. Now, those are 2 names famous in Revolutionary history. And in fact, John Adams said that James Otis Jr. was the father of the American Revolution. If you look, I mentioned earlier about the early pastors of the congregation. Jonathan Russell II married the sister to James Otis Sr. So Jonathan Russell II was the first minister at this meeting house. And he taught his niece and nephew, James and Mercy Otis, right here in the Meetinghouse. You'll also see a picture of a rooster. And as you go outside and you look back on top of the bell tower, you'll see a golden gilded rooster. It's this one here that was made for the Meetinghouse in 1723 in London. And it's been up there ever since, except for some repairs. And it was even on a different iteration of a steeple in the late 1800s. This is the Revere bell. It's actually the second Revere bell, because about in 1833, the original Revere bell had cracked, as they were known to do. And so this was made in the Revere Boston Foundry in Canton by his son and grandsons. It's a half-ton bell, and that's what we have up at the top of the bell tower. So I wanted to point out a few names here. I spoke before of Henry Jacob, who started the congregation in 1616, John Lothrop, who brought the congregation over from England in 1634. Jonathan Russell, the fourth one down here, was the first to be educated, I believe, of ours ministers at Harvard in 1683. His son, Jonathan Russell, was educated at Yale in the early 1700s, when Yale was called the Collegiate School before it moved to New Haven. It was the third institution of higher education at the time in the Americas, Harvard being number one. They were both established to train crops of ministers for the colony. They were training Puritan or Congregational ministers, and they needed another institution. That's why they built Yale, established Yale, and Jonathan Russell was one of their first products. Now, another name of note is sitting below the name Jonathan Russell II, you'll see Oakes Shaw. He was a minister here starting in 1760, but he was also noted as the father of Lemuel Shaw. He was the former Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, and he actually became the father-in-law of Herman Melville. Lemuel Shaw basically wrote the book of law as we know it now in Massachusetts. In the 1830s, with the disestablishment of the Standing Church of Massachusetts, there was a big scramble for membership. And the East Parish actually tore down the sister meeting house to this and built a new edifice in around 1833, 1835. That happened to burn down at the beginning of the 1900s. Here, this parish wasn't wealthy enough to start from scratch, so they remodeled the meeting house into something more neoclassical. They took out the bell tower, they put a spire on top of this end of the building, and the entrance would have been here. Because they didn't do much to change the interior, we were able in 1950s to restore back to its original form the meeting house. There's a great video showing actually pulling back the 18 feet in a movie from the 1950s during the restoration. So it's fascinating if you get a chance to see that. So post-World War I, a local professional woman, Elizabeth Crocker Jenkins, decided to try to start preserving history and started a campaign to return the West Parish Church into the West Meeting House. She's a Crocker. This land was acquired by the town from John Crocker in 1715. Jenkins was another early name in town. In fact, the early parsonage was the old Jenkins Manse. Well, then came the Depression, then came World War II, and somehow the cause was still going, where Elizabeth Crocker Jenkins was successful in establishing what was the Memorial Foundation. Now it's called the 1717 Meetinghouse Foundation. That was chartered 72 years ago in 1950 to be in charge of the history, this Meetinghouse's place in colonial history, to be in charge of its restoration, and to be in charge of the maintenance of this facility. We also hold town lectures here. We hold organ concerts here, other musical events here. Cape Cod Chorale performed here last Christmas time, holiday time. So this is a lively meeting house for the community. So as you leave the meeting house, just think of its position in American history. No, George Washington didn't stay here. In fact, this was built 15 years before George Washington was born. But the Sons of Liberty met nearby. And fierce arguments between loyalists and separatists occurred here. The true cradle of the American Revolution with James Otis Jr. started right here.